Chapter 10. The Ranch. I walked out of the supermarket and headed across the shopping center parking lot. The walk from our Topanga Canyon house had not been bad, but 2 shopping bags full of groceries made the return walk look difficult. I reached the road and turned to see 2 fellows in an old car slowing down as they approached. They were smiling. "You're headed back down the canyon, aren't you?" the driver asked. "Hop in." "Yeah, I sure am," I said, reaching for the door. I had seen them before, but didn't know them. As the opening conversation lulled, I asked, "Hey, you 2 guys don't know a place where about 20 people can live, do you?" The one on the passenger side said, "You're with Charlie Manson, aren't you?" "Yeah," I replied, "and we need a place to live. We're being kicked out of our house. It's gotten too small anyway." "Well, there is a place," the passenger said. "I'm not sure you can get in there, but it's perfect for you guys." I was excited. "Where is it?" "Well, it's the old Spahn Ranch, an old run-down place that was used for cowboy movies. I think the old Gene Autry and Roy Rogers movies were made there. It has a complete Western town movie set right there." "But who's there now?" I asked. "It's not used for much of anything now. Old man Spahn, George, lives there with a few cowhands, and they keep some horses for people to rent and ride. It's kind of a mess, and there's a lot of room, several houses and barns and other buildings. I think a few of the people from Topanga Canyon may be living in some of the buildings out back." "Where is this place?" I asked. "It's not too far, up at Chatsworth, up by Santa Susana Pass." When we got to the house, I took them in to meet Charlie. He was extraordinarily friendly and asked them for several more questions. "Sounds great, you guys," he said. "Maybe something will work out for us. We'll check it out." The 2 agreed to take me up to Chatsworth, north of the canyon, to look at the place. They were right. It was perfect. It had some wide open fields, lots of trees, and all kinds of gulches and hills, some rough and craggy just like the Wild West movies, some gentle. It was perfect. It was real nature, at last. The buildings were for the most part run down, in fact dilapidated in some cases. The main building, the owner's house, was right in front. Behind it was another house and some outbuildings. To the left was the movie set, a western street, a saloon, several stores. To the side and behind the street were a big corral and 2 barns. Farther back behind the buildings was a cliff, running down to a creek that crossed the property. Even farther back, a perfect setting for the little western town, were rough terrain and woods, then the mountains. It was rugged land. To the right, some distance from the main buildings, were a sizable house and some shacks. Hippies had moved into them, apparently with Spahn's permission. After my enthusiastic report, Charlie went to see Spahn and apparently did a masterful job of conning and manipulating the old man, who was nearly blind, into letting us live on the property. He convinced him that we would fix the place up in return for his letting us stay. And never missing an opportunity for enticement, Charlie told George about his young girls, about how nice it would be to have such pretty young women looking after him and meeting his every desire. When we showed up, Charlie drove the bus way out back behind the hippies' house, out into the fields, virtually out of sight. We camped there for some time as Charlie steadily ingratiated himself into Spahn's favor, convincing him the hippies were giving the place a bad name, and finally drove them out. It wasn't long until we, a group ranging from 15 to 20, had taken over the entire ranch, with the exception of George's house. And even there, several of the girls moved in to take care of the old man and keep him convinced we had his best interest at heart. Part of the movie set, including the big saloon, was turned into a main hangout for us. We set up a kitchen and used the saloon for our meals, parties, and other family events. We slept all over the place, in beds, sleeping bags, and whatever else would suffice. It was a perfect place for us. We got along well with the cowhands and managed not to interfere with the horse riding business. In fact, we used the horses a lot ourselves. All seemed to be going well until after several weeks, Charlie, for reasons that were never clear to me, decided we should split up. I never understood Charlie's reasoning in this. I knew only that he had fallen into one of his erratic, dark moods. He seemed to feel that the family concept would never work and that we were getting on each other's nerves, or that we just needed a change of scene. It could have been simply another of his calculated maneuvers to keep us shaken up, confused, and ultimately subservient to him. At any rate, under his direction, Mary, Pat, Ella, Stephanie, and I headed north in the old black school bus. We rented a house in the little town of Philo and launched a duplicate of life at Spahn's. It seemed that I was in charge, although others may have disputed this, and it was astounding, even to me, how I could control people just as Charlie had. I was able to mimic him perfectly. I could walk like him, talk like him, to the amazement of all who knew Charlie. The spookiest thing about it, however, was that I seemed to have the same sort of mind control over some of the girls that Charlie had over his followers. I found that I could actually read people's thoughts, just as Charlie could. I knew what the other girls were thinking and was able to manipulate and control them. I seemed to draw from them the same sort of loyalty that Charlie, as mean as he sometimes was, drew from us. Even some of Charlie's musical talent rubbed off on me. Just as he frequently did, I found myself composing and singing songs that were uncannily applicable to whatever situation we were in. The words and music just flowed into my mind. We were using drugs just as much as we had been at Spahn's, perhaps even more so, and my similarities to Charlie were powerfully revealed to me during one acid trip. It was late at night. Everyone was tripping. As I sat watching the other girls, I was aware of other persons within me. I had often sensed that I was in other people, but at that moment, I actually saw the dark, indistinct shapes within me. They were alive, moving, talking, laughing. I immediately recognized them as the same beings I had sensed in Charlie. My imitation of Charlie was perfect because we had the same things inside us. One day, I drove into San Francisco to replenish our LSD supply. While I was away, a gang of high school boys from Philo raided our house and with threats and sheer strength forced the girls to have sex with them. It was rape. When I returned, the gang of 7 or 8 boys was still there. They were threatening the girls further. But my roughness and confidence intimidated them, and I was able to entice them to stop by offering them acid. It was an unwise move. They went wild, turning their energy and wrath on the house and the bus. They literally tore up the bus, ripping out the insides and rendering it unusable. I was afraid they might kill us, but the rampage attracted attention, and before long the police arrived. They arrested the girls and me on charges of drug possession and contributing to the delinquency of minors. The boys were freed, but we were sentenced to 3 months in the Mendocino County Jail, finally getting that reduced to time already served while waiting trial plus probation. Similar experiences for the other members of Charlie's group brought us all back to Spahn's ranch. None of us could make it for long out in the world. It was a dangerous place. Life at Spahn, although intentionally unorganized, developed patterns. There were certain chores that had to be done, and most of the people accepted them without grumbling. Not me. I was a constant complainer, just plain mean. The assignments, of course, were ultimately dictated through subtle manipulation by Charlie, but usually most individuals took certain kinds of work on themselves without duress. Some of the women cooked for the men, including George Spahn and the cowboys. Some made beds, some washed dishes, others did laundry. All clothes were washed in buckets and hung out to dry. Very seldom were they ironed. Some were assigned the jobs of finding ways to get things we needed, usually in the early days by panhandling, using a parent's credit card, and stealing. We Manson girls were noted, for example, for our junkets to shopping centers where we raided the garbage cans for discarded food that was still edible. Most of us carry traces of acne and other problems resulting from eating things that were less than wholesome. Often the afternoons were quiet and slow, devoted to sleeping and lying around. Of course, sex was a major preoccupation, and lovemaking was apt to occur at almost any time of the day or night. During more leisurely times, games of every kind, checkers, chess, cards, and many varieties of word and number games might break out. And despite our professed corner on the world market of genuine love, much time was consumed in arguments and squabbles, and frequently petty gossiping and backstabbing. If they got out of hand, however, Charlie would always move in and suggest solutions, which was tantamount to dictating them. Dinner was an important time for us, the time when we overtly drew together as a community or family. We all gathered in the movie set saloon, sitting on the floor, the stage, chairs, some merely standing, and ate our evening meal out of the same pot. Some of our numbers in the fact that so much depended on our scrounging for food. Our main meals usually took shape as stews, rice dishes, bread, and coffee. Brown rice was such a main staple that we bought it in bags of 50 or more pounds. After dinner, we almost always smoked dope of some kind, getting high, singing a lot, dancing, making love, usually in couples, but frequently in groups if Charlie could talk us into it. During this period, my hair was returning to its natural dark brown color following the San Francisco bleach and frosted days, and it was growing long. Standing nearly 5'5" and weighing 115 pounds, I followed the fashion trend of mostly jeans and shirts, with an occasional turn in a long granny dress or a short skirt with a tight top. None of us wore shoes 95% of the time and no makeup, but we were heavy into beads and jewelry. We had reached the point of sharing everything, even underwear, although none of us wore bras. Sometimes girls would stash things they particularly liked. One girl was always trying to do this with underwear, and we would be discovered after a few days. Then, given a chance, I always preferred the sexier clothes. I wore pants as tight as possible, and, in other things, I strove for the clingy look. We women made many of our clothes, following the lead of a new girl, Nancy, who was an excellent seamstress. We could scrounge material, and she could do wonders with it. One thing we girls made that was special at that time was a multicolored vest for Charlie. It was begun by Lynn, and then Nancy joined in. One by one, all the girls made a contribution to it, except for me. I felt totally inadequate in the embroidery department at that time and thought the whole thing was rather foolish besides. But I eventually felt guilty about it and made a tiny patch, which someone later covered up anyhow. The unspoken idea was that your contribution represented how much you loved Charlie. As the last touch, we used our own hair and wove a hair lining and hair tassels for it. It was actually beautiful. Typical of the jealousy and rivalries among us, each of the guys decided he wanted a vest like that too, and picked out a girl to get us started. For nonconformists, we conformed a lot. We had just finished our evening meal, and joints were being passed around. It was a relaxed time. Charlie was seated in a chair somewhere near the middle of the saloon. I watched him for a minute as he began to warm up for one of his preaching sessions. Then my eyes wandered over the group, picking out the new faces. There was Tex, a quiet, rather clean-cut guy of about 21. His hair was getting long, but he still looked like the college student he had been before he dropped out with just a year or so to go. He was good-looking, and I immediately liked him. And there was Bobby. It appeared that he decided to throw in with us and stop trying to go his separate way with his own family. He was still very good-looking, although a bit scraggly right at that moment. There was Leslie. At 18 or 19, she had considerable mental and emotional strength. She was smart, more than able at that early stage to hold her own with anyone, except perhaps Charlie. There were many more. Catherine, Clem, Linda, old Bruce. Charlie was talking. He was sold on the idea of reincarnation. "We are ageless," he said. "We will never die. But nothing else is secure because time is running out for the world. The end of the world is coming. Society is killing the planet. Vietnam is just a part of it. And pollution, too. Society is evil. Big business is evil. The establishment is evil. Time is running out, and we've got to get out into the country, into the desert, to live off the land." It seemed to make so much sense. There was hardly a head in the room that didn't nod in concurrence, although later conversation convinced me that when Charlie talked like that, we all heard different things. He spieled generalities, and we supplied the details individually. "But despite this," he was saying, "we have to continue to live one day at a time. You should have all thrown away your clocks and watches. That's a must. There is no time. We're ageless. There is no time. Everything is now." Being stoned helped us to maintain this consciousness. "Love is free," he went on. "Love just loves. We are all one. God is everywhere, and everywhere is God. Nothing makes sense. There is no such thing as no such thing." The sentences all ran together, and my mind seemed torn and twisted as it tried to wrestle with them. But to the 20 or more dropouts in that little parcel of Southern California in the late summer of 1968, the year of the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., they sounded like the greatest words of wisdom ever uttered. In fact, many of the girls wept quietly as Charlie discussed the source of his understanding. "This is not something I've wanted," he said. "It happened one day in prison. The Infinite One just came into my cell and opened up my head. He showed me the truth, but I didn't want it. I cried and yelled at him. No, not me. But he showed me the truth. It was an October evening, and I was more than 7 months pregnant. Nearly a dozen of us were gathered in the back house at Spahn's, getting ready for a party with our supply of liquid acid. But Charlie and 2 of the girls were giving me a hard time about taking acid since my pregnancy was so far along. "Come on, Sadie," Charlie said. "Children are precious, and you've got to take care of yourself for your own sake as well as for the child's." But I wasn't convinced. I felt the warnings about drugs had, for the most part, been lies. "Nothing's going to happen to me, you guys," I said, laughing it off. "You've been giving me the best food for months and taking good care of me. Everything's going to be all right." Selfishness was in high gear within me. I wasn't going to miss out on some fun just because I was pregnant. So I prevailed and joined in the acid party. Little of a supernatural nature seemed to occur to me, but I did watch the baby's form within my belly drop drastically. There was no particular sensation, but the baby dropped. Giving it little thought, I joined in the party, except for the lovemaking, and we stayed up until dawn. I slept the whole day, waking in the evening with considerable discomfort in my lower back. I got out of bed, but was unable to stand for long. Finally, I gave up and went back to bed after refusing to eat the lunch one of the girls had brought me. I didn't feel like eating. All night I tossed and moaned, waking early the next morning exhausted and certain that my insides were coming apart. I couldn't sit and I couldn't stand, so I decided to walk, and for the whole day I walked from the back ranch house up to the front of the ranch, back and forth so many times I lost count. Some of the men saw me on the road and offered me rides as they made their daily runs into town, but I couldn't bear to sit. So I walked and smoked marijuana almost constantly, trying to alleviate the pain. At one time, when I was near the front of the ranch, I asked one of the girls, Sherry, to saddle an old mare for me so I could sit on her. As crazy as it seemed, I thought that straddling a horse might prove a way for me to sit down, but the pain was intense. Surely I can't go 2 months like this, I sobbed. As evening came, I walked back to the ranch house and lay on the couch in the big room, placing pillows under the small of my back. The women were preparing dinner, and it smelled good for a while. But then I knew I wouldn't be able to hold anything down. I was hungry and nauseous at the same time. At 7 o'clock, one of the men started a fire in the fireplace. It was cheery and everyone was in a good mood. Soon another party had evolved, but I was really out of it, although I did manage to get a toke on every joint that was passed around. I was desperate to overcome the pain, which by then was coming from contractions, although I didn't know what was going on. There were about 20 people in the room. The music was getting better, but louder, and the smell of marijuana blanketed everything. I couldn't take it any longer and slipped almost unnoticed into an adjoining room. The wall was paper thin, but I was away from the crowd. I was in deep labor and my groans became louder. Some minutes later, I was aware of someone beside the bed. It was TJ, one of the guys. He was kneeling beside me. "The baby's coming, isn't it?" he asked softly. I began to cry. Yes, and quick. For at least 20 minutes he knelt beside me, holding my hands during the contractions and then giving me a toke off his joint. But Charlie interrupted this scene. He seemed angry as he entered and told TJ to leave. "What in the world are you doing?" he said, turning to face me. His voice was sharp. I looked at him almost in panic. "I'm gonna have the baby real soon." He burst out laughing. "Oh, come on, Sadie. You're not due for 2 or 3 months. "You're wrong, Charlie," I said in desperation. "It's coming now." The anger returned to his face. "You're imagining things. Now knock it off and stop worrying about the baby. I need a shave. Will you boil me some water?" We didn't have a hot water tap in the back house, so I got out of bed, went to the kitchen, and began to boil some water. He's never lied to me before, I thought. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am foolish. But as I stood in the kitchen for at least 20 minutes, our old stove didn't put on much heat. The contractions came faster and faster. I managed to pour the water into a wooden bowl, got a fresh towel, and set up a mirror for him in the bathroom. And then, almost out of my mind, sat on the toilet. As I relieved myself, I saw I passed a lot of blood. I staggered to my feet and into the bedroom. "I don't care what you say, Charlie. The baby's coming now." I gasped for breath. "Charlie, TJ, Mary!" I seemed to cave in. Everything else came to a halt in the house. In my delirious state, it seemed people were running in every direction. Someone yelled, "Play music for the baby!" And the guitars and singing started up again. I yelled for them to stop, and there was silence. Then a rising and falling hubbub. The girls were all around me. Someone stroked my head with a damp cloth. Two held my hands during the contractions. They whispered softly to me from time to time. At one point of great pain, I yelled for Mary. "Thanks a lot," Charlie said sarcastically. Despite the agony, I heard him clearly. He seemed to think he was the father and should be called first. He was not the father. At 2:00 in the morning, October 7th, 1968, my baby was born. Tiny, weak, and transparent looking. His cry was a mere squeak. He was, in fact, the smallest baby I'd seen. 2 months premature, but alive and well. I heard one of the men, I'm not sure it was Charlie, tell one of the women to bite the umbilical cord. "That's the way the primeval man did it," he said. "Besides, we don't have any clean razor blades." The women took charge, however, and the cord was tied off with a violin G-string, the only catgut available. Nancy took charge of cleaning up the child as others tended to me. I was totally exhausted, but aware of a feeling I had never experienced. I felt I had transferred all my life into the child's, and somehow it seemed a holy glow engulfed me. I felt someone else present. It might have been the result of the large quantities of drugs I had been taking for days, but my awareness and perception were sharp, not drugged. The baby and I were both treated to clean, fresh clothes and sheets. We had all panhandled for money to buy the things that would be needed for this special event. Tired, clean, and warm, my son and I went smoothly to sleep on a bed placed near the fireplace just for us. The next day, one of the girls called a doctor she had known, and he came to check the baby and me. He said my son weighed only 2 pounds, yet every organ was perfect. He instructed me to use a doll's baby bottle to feed the child from my own milk. 5 days later, the women arranged for me to move with the baby to a nearby religious mission, a retreat house called the Fountain, where some of the girls had stayed occasionally, hoping to obtain it someday for the use of the people at Spahn's. I was granted permission to stay there as long as I would help with the work. So then the family had 2 children of its own, Mary's and mine. We eventually named my son Zezozece Zadfrack for no other reason than at the torn and twisted time it seemed like a good name. His name later became Paul.